Welcome back for another deep dive. We're picking up where we left off, exploring American reform movements, specifically the Progressive Era and the New Deal.
Yeah.
We're going to be using Richard Hofstadter's book, The Age of Reform, as a guide.
Great book.
Yeah, a classic.
Yeah, it is.
So our big question today is, how did this fiery idealism of the progressives transform into the pragmatic approach of the New Deal? How did that happen?
Well, that's a really interesting question and a really fascinating transition in American history.
Yeah.
I think what's key to understanding it is that the progressives weren't just reformers, right? They were moral crusaders. They were deeply convinced that they could perfect society by changing individuals.
So almost like a utopian vision for America. Did they really believe they could achieve that?
They absolutely did. They believed in the power of civic responsibility and self-sacrifice, as Hofstadter puts it. And they truly believed that a morally righteous citizenry was the key to solving America's problems.
Okay, so where do we see this play out? Like, where can we see examples of this in their actions or policies?
Well, I think a great example is Woodrow Wilson, who embodies that progressive zeal. He was initially very reluctant to get involved in World War I. But when he did finally command American forces, he framed it as this selfless mission to make the world safe for democracy, right? So it was about exporting American ideals to the rest of the world.
But did that idealistic vision hold up against the realities of war? I mean, it seems like there might have been a disconnect there between that rhetoric and reality.
There certainly was. The unimaginable brutality of World War I really shattered that progressive optimism. And I think it exposed a darkness in human nature that maybe their idealism hadn't fully accounted for.
Right. Yeah, so it's like the war kind of popped that idealistic bubble they were living in. Did this shift away from idealism happen like immediately after the war, or was it more of a gradual process?
It was more of a gradual disillusionment, a kind of a slow burn fueled by this cynicism that really followed the war. People kind of retreated from public life. They turned towards more private pursuits, and that fervor for reform, it seemed to kind of fizzle out.
So World War I was definitely a blow to progressive idealism, what ultimately shattered it and set the stage for the New Deal.
I think the Great Depression was the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
It's such a devastating economic shock that it wiped out any remaining optimism, and it really demanded immediate practical solutions, right? People were no longer concerned with these grand moral crusades. They needed food, they needed jobs, they needed a roof over their heads.
So the focus shifted from changing individuals to fixing the system itself.
Exactly, and this is where we see a major turning point, right? This period saw a dramatic shift in how Americans viewed the role of government. Before, they believed in a more hands-off approach, limited government intervention in the economy. But the Depression was so severe that people were desperate for someone to step in and fix things.
Enter FDR.
Exactly. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal.
And he wasn't afraid to take action.
No, he wasn't.
But how did his approach to solving problems differ from what the progressives had in mind?
Well, I think a good way to think about it is the progressives really believed in competition and individual initiative as these engines of progress, right? So take, for example, their approach to monopolies and trusts. They wanted to break them up to create a fair playing field, assuming that if you have a truly competitive market, individual effort would lead to prosperity. But the New Deal had a different strategy.
And what was his strategy? I mean, he couldn't just ignore the widespread unemployment and devastation.
The New Deal was all about pragmatism. It took a much more interventionist approach, using the power of the federal government to directly address the crisis. So this meant creating programs like the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which directly employed millions of Americans in public works projects, and it was a complete departure from the reliance on individual initiative that the progressives championed.
Right, so it sounds like the New Deal wasn't just about different policies, it was a completely different philosophy of government. Did this new approach get any pushback? I mean, weren't people hesitant to embrace such a huge change?
Well, there was definitely resistance. Hoover, for example, despite his efforts, still clung to this idea of limited government and rugged individualism. He believed that the economy would eventually self-correct, but FDR recognized the need for a much more hands-on approach.
So this clash between Hoover and FDR kind of perfectly encapsulates this transition from progressive ideals to New Deal pragmatism. Would you say that the New Deal was a direct response to the perceived failures of the progressive era?
I wouldn't say it was a direct response to failures, but rather a necessary evolution in light of these, changing circumstances. The world was a different place after the war, and the Depression and what worked in the progressive era simply wasn't sufficient to meet the challenges of the 1930s. And I think the New Deal recognized that shift and offered a new way forward.
So we've got this pretty big shift from individual moral reform to these systemic government-led solutions. What else, besides their approach to economics, sets the progressives and the New Dealers apart?
Well, Hofstadter points to a really fascinating detail, and that's their vocabulary. The language that they used reveals their very different worldviews.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit earlier. It's like peering into their minds.
Yeah, it is.
Give us some examples. What kind of language did the progressives use, and how did it differ from that of the New Dealers?
Well, progressives spoke in terms of conscience, soul, morals, duty, shame, disgrace, even sin. It was a vocabulary that really appealed to personal responsibility and moral righteousness. They believed that societal change began with individual transformation. But the New Dealers, facing very different realities, spoke a different language.
So if the progressives were all about soul-searching, what were the New Dealers focused on? What words characterized their approach?
They emphasized efficiency planning experts, administration, economic engineering. Their focus was on practical solutions, data-driven decisions, and this belief in the power of government to really manage the economy. They were less concerned with changing hearts and minds and more concerned with getting things done.
That is a stark contrast.
It is.
But, I mean, both eras had their strengths and weaknesses, right? It's not like one approach was inherently better than the other.
Exactly. It's about understanding the context of each era and recognizing that different challenges call for different approaches. And I think both the progressives and the New Dealers ultimately were driven by a desire to improve the lives of Americans. But their methods and their understanding of the role of government differed dramatically.
So we've established that the New Deal marked a huge shift in American thought. But what about the cultural impact of these eras? How did life actually change for everyday Americans beyond, the realm of politics and economics?
That's a great question, and one that Hofstadter explores in detail. He highlights how even something as personal as leisure time was viewed differently in each era.
That's really interesting. We'll have to dive into that next time, so stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll be exploring the cultural landscape of the Progressive era and the New Deal, and how these massive historical shifts actually played out in the lives of everyday Americans. Welcome back. Last time we talked about how the idealism of the Progressive era kind of gave way to a more pragmatic approach of the New Deal. But how did these big changes actually, how did they affect the lives of everyday Americans?
Well, one interesting area that Hofstadter talks about is leisure, like how Americans thought about leisure and how that changed.
Oh, geez.
The progressives were, remember, all about moral uplift.
Right.
They saw leisure as something that could either, elevate or corrupt the individual.
So it wasn't just about kicking back and relaxing after a hard day's work. There was a moral dimension to leisure time.
Absolutely. They were wary of things like gambling and excessive drinking. Even some forms of entertainment were seen as vulgar or debased, like vaudeville or early cinema. Mm-hmm. They really wanted to steer people towards leisure activities that they deemed, beneficial.
So I'm picturing community sing-alongs and uplifting lectures.
Right.
Did they have anything to say about sports? Was baseball okay?
Well, baseball actually really flourished during the Progressive era. But even something as seemingly innocent as baseball could be viewed through this lens of moral improvement.
Okay.
It was a wholesome outdoor activity. It emphasized teamwork and physical fitness, so it fit into their vision of, productive leisure.
So it wasn't banning fun, but it was use your free time wisely.
Right, exactly.
So how did the New Deal kind of change this idea of leisure?
Well, the New Deal ushered in a really noticeable shift with the Depression weighing so heavily on everyone. The focus kind of moved away from individual morality and more towards economic well-being and social stability. So leisure became less about moral uplift and more about just providing relief and distraction from the harsh realities of the time.
People needed an escape.
Exactly. They needed an escape.
So did this lead to any particular forms of entertainment becoming more popular?
Oh, absolutely. This is the golden age of radio movies, swing dancing, right?
Yeah.
These provided much-needed escapism, a sense of community, and it's also important to remember that the government itself played a role in promoting these activities through programs like the WPA, which employed artists and performers and funded cultural projects.
It's interesting to see how government policies can actually shape how people spend their free time.
Yeah.
It highlights the impact that these bigger historical forces had. But let's go back to Hofstadter for a second. He had another interesting observation about the progressives and the New Dealers.
Yeah.
And it was about the language they used, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Remember how we discussed their really contrasting vocabularies?
Right, different dictionaries.
Yeah. And this is where we really get a sense of their different mindsets. Hofstadter notices that progressives really emphasize words like conscience, morals, duty, shame, disgrace, sin. Like, their language was steeped in this morality, and it appealed to people's sense of personal responsibility.
It's almost like they were trying to, guilt people into being better citizens.
Right. Did that work? Did that approach resonate with people?
I mean, it resonated with some, especially those who were already inclined towards social reform, but it also alienated others who felt judged or preached to the deal. The New Deal, on the other hand, adopted a very different tone.
So how would you describe the language of the New Deal? What words captured their approach?
Well, their vocabulary was much more practical, much less moralistic. They talked about efficiency planning experts, administration, economic engineering. Their language really reflected this shift away from moral crusading towards a more technocratic approach to problem solving.
So less about appealing to people's hearts and more about appealing to their minds.
Exactly.
Was this a deliberate strategy or just a reflection of the times, do you think?
Probably a little bit of both. The New Deal was born out of this crisis that demanded immediate practical solutions. And, moral arguments weren't going to put food on the table or get people back to work. Yeah. Their language reflected this need for action and this belief in the power of government to, manage the economy and improve people's lives. And that shift in language reflects that broader shift in American political thought. It's like the New Deal legitimized government intervention in a way that would have been unthinkable a few decades earlier.
Exactly. And it's a legacy that continues to shape our political discourse today. We're still wrestling with these same questions. What is the role of government? What is the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility? How much power should the government have,
Right. So understanding the historical roots of these debates is crucial if we want to make sense of our own political landscape.
Yeah, I agree.
It's not just like ancient history. It's directly relevant to the things that we're facing today. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, there's one more aspect of this cultural shift I want to explore.
Okay.
Hofstadter mentions a kind of cultural backlash that emerged after World War I. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so Hofstadter describes the 1920s as this period of disillusionment and cynicism.
Yeah.
After the war, a lot of Americans felt exhausted by the progressive era's moral fervor. They were tired of being told how to live their lives. They just wanted to enjoy themselves, embrace the pleasures of modern life.
So was this a complete rejection of progressive values, or was it more like a pendulum swing, a natural reaction to a period of, really intense moral focus?
I think it was more of a shift in mood, a turning away from that earnestness and self-sacrifice that had defined, the previous era. People were more interested in personal fulfillment and having a good time and making money.
Mm-hmm.
Think, flappers, jazz music, the rise of consumer culture as a time of social and cultural experimentation.
So in a way, this cultural backlash actually paved the way for the New Deal.
Potentially.
The excesses of the 1920s, the unchecked pursuit of wealth and pleasure, ultimately led to the economic collapse, which made the New Deal possible.
That's a really interesting point. You can definitely see how these different periods are interconnected, how they react to and build upon the ones that came before it. It's this fascinating tapestry of social, political, economic forces all kind of intertwined.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to remember that this wasn't just about, presidents and policies. This was about people.
Yeah.
This was about everyday Americans who were living through these really tumultuous times.
Exactly. It's about the people who struggled and persevered and fought for a better future. Their stories are what make this period so compelling and so relevant to us today.
Speaking of stories, Hofstadter does a fantastic job of bringing this era to life, through his descriptions and analysis. And he doesn't shy away from the complexities and the contradictions. He paints a really nuanced picture of a nation kind of in transition.
Yeah, he does a brilliant job of showing us how interconnected everything is. The social, the economic, the political, and how these big events can reshape a nation's identity. It's fascinating to see how even seemingly small details like changes in language or leisure activities can tell us so much about a society's values and priorities.
And it's important to remember that these shifts didn't happen overnight, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were the result of really complex and often contradictory forces. But what's so cool about this period is that it shows us how much change is possible.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history is never really finished. It's a continuous process of change and evolution.
So are you ready to jump into the final part of our exploration where we'll unpack the lasting legacy of these two eras?
I can't wait. This is where we connect all the dots and see how these historical shifts continue to impact us today.
Well, let's dive in. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. It's pretty amazing how those two eras, we've been talking about the Progressive era and the New Deal, how much they still influence our thinking today, about government and reform, even individual responsibility.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much those two seemingly, distant eras still shape our conversations and debates.
Thinking back to the progressives and their emphasis on moral perfection, it feels like they were setting themselves up for disappointment. Their hopes were so high, their faith in human progress was so strong. Could they have ever really achieved that kind of utopian society they were dreaming of?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, the progressives were incredibly optimistic. They really believed they could, eradicate social problems through individual moral improvement. But then you have the brutal realities of war, economic depression, just the complexity of human nature in general that chipped away at that optimism.
Right, and the New Dealers kind of saw those limitations and they took a different approach. It wasn't about achieving a perfect society. It was more about alleviating suffering and making the system work better for everybody.
Exactly. Their focus was less about, reaching some grand moral vision and more about pragmatically addressing the immediate needs of the people. Right, put people back to work, establish those social safety nets, restore faith in a system that felt broken.
And that shift from focusing on individual morality to tackling these systemic issues, it feels like a huge turning point in American history.
It does.
Would you say that the New Deal basically redefined the role of government and the whole idea of reform?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. The New Deal ushered in this era where government intervention in the economy became not only acceptable, but totally necessary. And it marked a fundamental shift in American political thought, right? This move away from laissez-faire principles towards a more active role for the government in, ensuring social and economic well-being.
And that shift is still playing out in our political debates today.
Yeah.
Right, we're still grappling with these same questions about the role of government, individual freedom versus collective responsibility.
Yeah, all those fundamental questions, we're still wrestling with them.
We are, and understanding the historical roots of these debates, seeing how these ideas evolved over time, it's so important if we really want to understand our own political landscape.
I agree. It makes you realize that history is never really that far behind us.
It's not. It's all connected. What's really interesting is how Hofstadter connects the New Deal, not just to a change in, political and economic thinking, but also to a shift in the American character itself.
Right, and that's a point that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
I think he argues that the New Deal actually fostered a stronger sense of community, this greater willingness to sacrifice for the common good. Think about Social Security.
Yeah.
It was a radical departure from that prevailing ethos of individualism. It established a system of shared responsibility for the well-being of all citizens.
So the New Deal was born out of this crisis, right? And it ended up reshaping American identity.
In a way, yes. I mean, it promoted a new kind of American one less defined by that rugged individualism and more attuned to the needs of the collective. Of course, this vision wasn't, universally embraced. Even today, the New Deal is still debated and reinterpreted.
Right.
Some celebrate it as, a triumph of social democracy, while others criticize it as, government overreach.
It's so fascinating how those debates are still going on. It just shows how much of an impact the New Deal had on American society. But at its core, it's a story about people.
It is.
People trying to survive this huge economic crisis, people fighting for fairness, people coming together to try to build a better future.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this period so compelling and so relevant even today.
Yeah, it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and names and events. It's about the human spirit. The struggle for justice and the desire for a more equitable society.
Absolutely. And that's a reminder that the past is never really past, right? It shapes our values, our institutions, even the choice we make today.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Progressive era and the New Deal, I hope you're walking away with a sense of just how important this period was in American history and how relevant it still is to us today.
I hope so too. By studying the past, we gain insights into the present and equip ourselves to navigate the challenges of the future. Who knows, maybe someday you'll be writing the definitive history of this era, drawing new connections and sparking new debates.
That's a thought, but for now we'll leave that to the historians. Thanks for joining us on this journey through American history, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.